February 9th, 1944, the Mediterranean coast off southern France. Second Lieutenant Bob Hoover's Spitfire, Mark V fighter, was dying beneath him, its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine coughing black smoke across the winter sky. German flak had found its mark. The 22-year-old pilot from Nashville, Tennessee, fought the controls as his aircraft descended toward the cold water below. This was his 59th combat mission with the Army Air Force's 52nd Fighter Group. He would not complete it in an American aircraft. The Spitfire hit the Mediterranean hard. Hoover scrambled free of the sinking fighter, his flight suit soaked through, his body already going numb in the February waters. Within minutes, a German patrol boat cut through the waves toward him. The war, for Bob Hoover, had just transformed from aerial combat to a different kind of survival. He was pulled from the water and taken prisoner. Ahead lay 16 months in captivity, and then, impossibly, an escape that would require him to master an enemy aircraft he had never flown, using controls labeled in a language he could not read, to navigate across 200 miles of hostile territory without maps, radio, or any way to identify himself to Allied forces, who would see only a German fighter bearing enemy markings. The capture itself was almost routine by 1944 standards. German forces had developed efficient systems for processing Allied airmen. Hoover was transported to Stalag Luft I, a prisoner of war camp in Bath, Germany, on the Baltic Sea coast. The camp held thousands of Allied aviators, primarily American and British pilots and aircrew. These were not soldiers captured in ground combat. These were technical specialists, men trained in the most advanced machinery of modern warfare, now confined behind wire in a nation that was slowly being crushed between Allied advances from east and west. Life in Stalag Luft. I followed patterns that thousands of prisoners knew intimately. The cold was constant, penetrating wooden barracks that offered minimal insulation against German winter. Food arrived in quantities calculated to sustain life without providing strength. Red Cross parcels supplemented German rations, but never adequately. Prisoners lost weight steadily. Their bodies consumed muscle for fuel. Their minds remained sharp, occupied with elaborate escape plans. Educational courses taught by fellow prisoners. Theatrical productions. Anything to maintain sanity against the grinding monotony of captivity. The psychology of captivity operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Physical deprivation was obvious and quantifiable. Prisoners could measure their weight loss, count the hours spent in cold barracks, calculate the calories in their daily rations. But the mental erosion was more insidious. Each day resembled the previous one. Routines became rituals. Hope became a discipline requiring active maintenance. Without it, men deteriorated into listless existence, waiting passively for whatever fate would bring. Hoover endured this for over a year, through winter, into spring, into summer, into another winter. The war continued beyond the wire. In June 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy. By autumn, they were fighting across France. In the east, Soviet armies pushed relentlessly westward. The Third Reich was contracting, month by month, week by week. Every prisoner in Stalag Luft I understood the mathematics. Liberation was coming. The only question was whether they would survive long enough to see it. The camp itself represented a peculiar microcosm of military culture transplanted into captivity. Rank structures persisted. Senior officers commanded respect and organized activities. Pilots maintained their identity as aviators even without aircraft. They discussed tactics, debated aircraft performance characteristics, critiqued missions they had flown. This preservation of professional identity served a psychological function. It reminded them they were temporary captives, not permanent prisoners. Their identities remained intact, waiting to resume when circumstances permitted. By early 1945, the German military structure was collapsing. Units that had once maintained rigid discipline now operated with depleted personnel and failing supply lines. Camp guards, mostly older men or those wounded and reassigned from combat duty, grew less vigilant as news from the fronts grew worse. Some deserted outright, disappearing into the chaos of a nation coming apart at its seams, prisoners noticed. The wire remained, but the eyes watching it grew fewer. This disintegration was not sudden. It accumulated gradually through thousands of small failures. Replacement guards didn't arrive. Supply deliveries came late or not at all. Orders from higher command became confused or contradictory. The Wehrmacht was experiencing systemic collapse, not from single catastrophic defeat, but from cumulative erosion of the organizational capacity that had made it formidable. Every system has breaking points. By April 1945, German military organization had exceeded multiple breaking points simultaneously. General Dwight Eisenhower, commanding Allied forces in Europe, issued explicit orders to prisoners of war: do not attempt escape. Allied armies were advancing rapidly. Liberation would come soon. Escape attempts at this stage risked death for minimal gain. Better to wait days or weeks than die kilometers from freedom. Most prisoners followed these orders. Bob Hoover did not. His decision reflected a particular psychology common among successful aviators. Pilots are trained to act decisively in emergencies. They learn to assess situations rapidly and commit to courses of action even with incomplete information. Waiting is sometimes correct, but so is action. The judgment about which response fits, which situation separates adequate pilots from exceptional ones. Hoover's entire training had emphasized seizing initiative when opportunities appeared. He saw opportunity in the deteriorating camp security. One night in late April 1945, the camp erupted in chaos. Several thousand prisoners, driven by desperation or opportunism, or simply the need to do something after months of forced inaction, began fighting among themselves. It was not organized. It was not rational. It was the pressure of captivity finding release in violence. Guards rushed to contain the riot. In that moment of distraction, Hoover and two other prisoners made their move. They scaled the fence and dropped into the darkness beyond. They moved quickly down a dirt road. 3 American airmen in enemy territory, wearing whatever clothing they had managed to scavenge in camp. They had no weapons, no maps, no clear plan beyond putting distance between themselves and Stalag Luft I. Within hours, they reached a farmhouse standing alone in the countryside. The farmhouse was occupied by a single German woman. The war had taken the men. She was alone. The 3 Americans knocked. The woman opened the door and saw them for what they were. She did not hesitate. She brought them inside and cooked food. Real food, not the thin soup and stale bread of camp rations. She fed 3 enemy soldiers because they were hungry, and she had food. When they prepared to leave, Hoover wrote a note explaining what she had done. He asked her to show it to American forces when they arrived, hoping it might protect her from reprisal. The woman gave them something more valuable than food. She gave them a pistol and several magazines of ammunition. This exchange revealed the war's transformation in its final weeks. The woman faced no ideology, no propaganda, no military orders. She faced 3 exhausted men who needed help. Her response was fundamentally human, transcending the national and military categories that had organized the conflict. By April 1945, many German civilians had reached similar conclusions. The war was lost. Survival required pragmatic responses to immediate circumstances, not adherence to abstract principles about loyalty or enemy status. The 3 men continued on foot, then found bicycles and rode for several miles. They were heading west, toward Allied lines, though they had only approximate ideas of where those lines currently existed. The front moved daily. What had been German-held yesterday might be American-held today, or might be contested ground where both sides sent patrols. They needed transportation better than bicycles. They needed to cover ground quickly. They came upon an airfield. It appeared abandoned, or nearly so. German airfields in late April 1945 were often in this state. Fuel was scarce, trained pilots were scarcer. Aircraft that remained were often damaged, cannibalized for parts, or simply left sitting because there was no longer any organized structure to fly them. The 3 Americans approached cautiously. Hoover, trained as a pilot, began inspecting the aircraft scattered across the field. He was looking for one thing: an aircraft capable of flight. The airfield itself told a story of organizational collapse. Under normal military operations, airfields are scenes of intense, coordinated activity. Ground crews maintain aircraft continuously. Fuel trucks move between dispersal points. Pilots brief missions and prepare for flight. Command structures coordinate operations. But this airfield showed none of that. Aircraft sat in random positions. No ground crews were visible. The infrastructure of military aviation had simply stopped functioning. Most of what he found was wreckage. Planes with engines removed, control surfaces damaged, fuel tanks empty. The Luftwaffe had been systematically destroyed, not just by Allied bombing, but by its own inability to sustain operations. Replacement parts didn't arrive. Fuel shipments stopped. Maintenance crews were reassigned to infantry units. What remained were the physical artifacts of an air force that no longer functionally existed. Then, Hoover found it. A Focke-Wulf Fw 190 reconnaissance variant. The aircraft showed damage, But it had one critical characteristic that separated it from every other plane on that field. Its fuel tank was full. The Focke-Wulf Fw-190 was one of the finest fighters Germany had produced during the war. Introduced in 1941, it had given Luftwaffe pilots an aircraft that could match or exceed Allied fighters in multiple performance categories. The radial engine provided exceptional power. The wide-track landing gear made it stable during takeoff and landing. Its armament was devastating. By 1945, the Fw-190 had evolved into multiple variants, including reconnaissance versions equipped with cameras instead of some weapons systems. This was such a variant. The aircraft represented the culmination of German aviation engineering philosophy. Where British and American designers favored inline engines with their streamlined profiles, Kurt Tank, the Fw-190's designer, had chosen a radial configuration. The BMW 801 engine, with 14 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, provided 1,700 horsepower at takeoff. This power came with air cooling advantages. No vulnerable coolant systems to be damaged by enemy fire. No complex plumbing requiring maintenance. The radial engine was robust, maintainable, reliable. Tank had also prioritized pilot ergonomics in ways unusual for German designs. The cockpit was spacious by fighter standards. Controls were positioned logically. Visibility was excellent, particularly important for reconnaissance variants that needed to observe ground targets while remaining aware of potential threats. The wide landing gear tracked 75 inches apart, providing stability during ground operations that single-wheel designs could not match. But the Fw-190's most revolutionary feature was its control system. Tank had implemented an electric motor system that assisted the pilot's control inputs. This power-assisted control gave the aircraft its legendary roll rate. The Fw-190 could roll faster than any Allied fighter. In combat, this translated to tactical advantage. A pilot could reverse direction, evade attacks, or position for shots with speed that opponents simply could not match. Hoover climbed into the cockpit. He had never flown an Fw-190. He had never flown any German aircraft. He had fired at them, watched them fall burning from the sky. But he had never sat in one, never touched its controls, never attempted to start its engine. The cockpit was labeled entirely in German. Every instrument, every switch, every control surface indicator used language and symbols he did not understand. He would have to deduce the aircraft's operation through logic and experimentation. The instrument panel confronted him with immediate challenges. German instruments used different conventions than American ones. The altimeter measured in meters, not feet. The airspeed indicator showed kilometers per hour, not miles per hour or knots. The fuel gauge markings were unfamiliar, but Hoover possessed something more valuable than specific knowledge of this aircraft. He possessed deep understanding of how aircraft systems function generally. All fighters share fundamental similarities. They have engines requiring fuel, air, and ignition. They have control surfaces requiring hydraulic or mechanical systems. They have instruments measuring speed, altitude, engine performance, fuel state. The specific implementation varies, but the underlying principles remain constant. Hoover could work backward from principles to specifics. A German mechanic appeared, stunning the 3 Americans. He demanded they halt. The 2 other escapees immediately pulled the pistol the farm woman had given them and pointed it at the mechanic. Hoover made a proposal. "Start the engine," he told the mechanic. "Help me get this aircraft running, and you live. My friends keep the gun and help their own escape." The mechanic, facing armed men and recognizing that the war was effectively over, complied. This moment crystallized the war's transformation. The mechanic was not betraying Germany. He was simply recognizing reality. The aircraft would be captured by Allied forces within days or weeks regardless. His death would serve no purpose. Cooperation meant survival. The calculation was straightforward. That he made it quickly suggested many Germans had reached similar conclusions by late April 1945. The Fw-190's BMW 801 radial engine coughed, then caught. 14 cylinders arranged in 2 rows began their synchronized firing sequence. The propeller rotated, slowly at first, then accelerating into the characteristic blur of an aircraft preparing for flight. Hoover had no time for pre-flight checks, no time for systems verification, no time for anything except the most basic assessment. The engine runs, the controls respond, the fuel gauge shows full. The sound of that engine starting represented both technology and desperation. The BMW 801 was a masterpiece of engineering, capable of producing enormous power reliably under combat conditions. but it was being started by an enemy pilot under coercion, about to be stolen for purposes opposite to its design intent. Technology serves whoever controls it. The engine didn't care who operated the throttle. It simply responded to inputs according to its engineering. He did not taxi to the runway. There was no time for proper procedures. German personnel would be responding to the sound of an engine starting without authorization. Hoover simply advanced the throttle and pointed the FW-190 across the grass field. The aircraft accelerated. Its wide landing gear kept it stable over uneven ground. At 60 miles per hour, then 80, then over 100, the aircraft's wings began generating lift. Hoover pulled back on the stick. The FW-190 lifted into the air. The takeoff itself violated every procedure in every flight manual. Proper takeoffs involve pre-flight checks, engine run-ups, control verification, systematic progression through checklists. Hoover had done none of this. He had simply started the engine and applied power. That the aircraft responded correctly testified to both German engineering quality and extraordinary luck. A single system failure during that takeoff would have been fatal. He was flying an enemy aircraft over enemy territory toward Allied lines. Every aspect of this situation was potentially fatal. If German fighters found him, they might recognize the stolen aircraft and shoot him down. If German anti-aircraft crews spotted him, they would see an FW-190 flying erratically and might engage. If Allied forces encountered him, they would see only a German fighter and would absolutely engage. He had no radio to communicate his identity. He had no signal flares. He had no parachute. If anything went wrong, he would simply die. Hoover kept the aircraft low, following the terrain. The FW-190 was designed for exactly this kind of flying. Its powerful engine provided acceleration at low altitude. Its control harmony allowed precise maneuvering close to the ground. He flew west, following his internal compass, looking for landmarks that might indicate he had crossed into Allied-held territory. The landscape below was scarred by war. Destroyed vehicles, burned buildings, cratered roads. The physical evidence of armies that had fought across this ground multiple times. Low-altitude flight in the FW-190 revealed the aircraft's design philosophy. Tank had created a fighter optimized for combat below 20,000 feet, where most engagements occurred. The supercharger system provided maximum boost at these altitudes. The engine cooling remained effective even at high power settings near the ground. The control forces remained manageable, allowing precise maneuvering without excessive pilot effort. American fighters like the P-51 performed better at high altitude, but down low, the FW-190 was supreme. Hoover was experiencing this superiority firsthand, though under circumstances Tank never imagined. The aircraft responded crisply to control inputs. The engine provided smooth, powerful thrust. The visibility from the cockpit allowed him to navigate by visual reference, following roads and rivers westward. The FW-190 was teaching him its characteristics through direct experience, the most effective form of pilot training, though normally conducted under less desperate circumstances. The German cross painted on the fuselage and wings was enormous, unmistakable. Every Allied soldier, every Allied gunner, every Allied pilot had been trained to recognize that symbol and destroy anything bearing it. Hoover understood that his survival depended on speed and luck. He could not make himself invisible. He could only move too quickly for anyone to organize a response. This created an impossible paradox. Flying low increased his vulnerability to ground fire, but decreased his visibility to aircraft. Flying high made him more visible but potentially safer from ground-based weapons. There was no optimal solution, only trade-offs between different categories of risk. Hoover chose low and fast, betting that speed would protect him better than altitude. He flew for 200 miles, over forests and fields and small towns, over roads clogged with refugees and military vehicles moving in both directions. The fuel gauge descended steadily. The BMW 801 engine consumed fuel at rates calculated for combat operations, not for extended flight. Hoover watched the gauge and calculated range. He needed to reach Allied lines before the fuel ran out. Landing short meant capture or death. Flying too far meant running out of fuel over territory, whose control he could not determine. The fuel consumption calculation revealed another challenge of flying unfamiliar aircraft. The FW-190's fuel gauges were marked in liters, not gallons. Hoover had to estimate remaining fuel by gauge position rather than numerical reading. The BMW 801 consumed approximately 300 liters per hour at cruise power settings, but he was flying at higher power to maximize speed. His fuel consumption was probably closer to 400 liters per hour. The main tank held 600 liters. He had perhaps 90 minutes of flight time before the engine stopped. Then he saw them. Windmills. The characteristic windmills of the Netherlands. Dutch landscape, which meant Allied territory, which meant American or British or Canadian forces who might possibly accept his surrender before shooting him. Hoover had no charts, no maps, nothing except the knowledge that windmills meant the Netherlands, and the Netherlands meant liberation. The windmills were not just geographical markers. They represented a specific technology adapted to particular landscape. The Netherlands had used windmills for centuries to manage water levels, pump drainage, mill grain. They were distinctive, unmistakable. Hoover recognized them instantly because they signified a landscape that German-occupied territory no longer resembled. The Netherlands had been liberated. Those windmills meant safety. He brought the Fw-190 down into a field. The landing was rough, the aircraft was damaged, and Hoover had never landed this type before. He had no practice, no training, no familiarity with how the Fw-190 behaved during landing. He simply brought it down as carefully as he could and hoped the landing gear would absorb the impact. The aircraft bounced, settled, rolled across grass, and stopped. The landing revealed how much Hoover had learned about the aircraft during his 200-mile flight. He had judged the approach speed correctly, probably around 120 miles per hour. He had managed the power reduction smoothly. He had aligned with the wind despite having no wind indicators. He had judged the flare height accurately enough that the aircraft touched down with gear intact. All of this without formal training, without manuals, without any resource except his general knowledge of how fighters behave during landing. Dutch farmers surrounded the aircraft immediately, approaching with pitchforks and whatever implements they had. They saw a German fighter in their field. Then they saw the pilot climb out, an American wearing prisoner-of-war clothing, exhausted and probably in shock. The farmers held their positions, uncertain. Then a British army truck arrived, soldiers piling out with weapons ready. Hoover was taken into custody, not as a prisoner, but as a liberated airman whose story required verification. The British soldiers listened to his account with expressions mixing skepticism and amazement. An American fighter pilot, shot down over a year ago, imprisoned in Germany, escaped from the camp, found a German airfield, stole an aircraft he had never flown, navigated 200 miles without instruments or maps, and landed safely in Allied territory. The story sounded impossible, but here was the man, and here was the aircraft. A genuine Focke-Wulf Fw-190 sitting in a Dutch field with German markings still visible. The verification process revealed military bureaucracy's persistence even in war's final days. Intelligence officers needed to confirm Hoover's identity through service records. They needed to verify his imprisonment through Red Cross documentation. They needed to establish that he was genuinely an escaped American pilot and not a German agent using an elaborate cover story. This process took days, during which Hoover remained in Allied custody, his status ambiguous. Hoover was transported to Allied headquarters for debriefing. Intelligence officers questioned him extensively. They wanted details about Stalag Luft I, its location, security procedures, prisoner population, guard strength. They wanted information about the airfield where he found the Fw-190, how many aircraft remained, what security was present, whether other operational aircraft existed. They wanted his assessment of German military organization in the final weeks of the war. His escape had given him unique observational access to enemy conditions. The intelligence value extended beyond immediate tactical information. Hoover's observations contributed to Allied understanding of German military collapse. The abandoned airfield, the full fuel tank in an unguarded aircraft, the mechanic's immediate cooperation, the farmwoman's willingness to help. All of these data points revealed an enemy military structure that had fundamentally ceased functioning. This information helped Allied commanders understand that German resistance would crumble rapidly, influencing decisions about final operations. Eventually, his identity was confirmed through military records and testimony from other 52nd Fighter Group personnel. Bob Hoover was officially liberated. He later downplayed the escape's difficulty. The guards had largely deserted the camp, he said. Security was minimal in the final weeks of the war. People made it sound like a great escape, he would later recall, but the guards had abandoned their posts. This modesty understated the genuine risk he had taken and the extraordinary skill required to fly an unfamiliar aircraft across hostile territory. The technical achievement alone was remarkable. The FW-190's cockpit layout differed substantially from American and British fighters. German aviation used different conventions for instrument arrangement, different control mechanisms, different procedures. Hoover had to deduce throttle position, mixture controls, propeller pitch, landing gear operation, flap settings, everything that a pilot normally learns through hours of training, all in the minutes between starting the engine and taking off. Consider the specific technical challenges. The throttle operated in reverse from Allied aircraft. Push forward to reduce power, pull back to increase it. This reversal could be fatal in emergency situations where instinct drives responses faster than conscious thought. Hoover had to recognize this difference and override his trained reflexes. The propeller pitch control required management he had to infer from engine sound and aircraft performance. Too fine a pitch and the engine would over-rev and destroy itself. Too coarse and the aircraft would lack acceleration. Finding the correct setting required trial and error while maintaining aircraft control. The BMW 801 radial engine operated differently from the inline engines Hoover knew from Spitfires. Radial engines required different starting procedures, different management of cylinder head temperatures, different responses to power settings. The BMW 801's fuel injection system eliminated the carburetor icing issues common in Allied fighters, but it introduced mixture management complexities Hoover had to solve in real time. Rich mixture at low altitude wasted fuel. Lean mixture at high power settings risked engine damage. Finding the balance required constant adjustment. The aircraft's handling characteristics were unfamiliar. The FW-190 was known for excellent roll rate but heavy elevator forces. It accelerated quickly but required strength to pull into turns. Its stall characteristics differed from Allied fighters. All of these factors, normally learned through progressive training flights, Hoover had to discover while flying at low altitude over hostile territory, where any mistake meant death. After liberation, Hoover returned to the United States. The war in Europe ended weeks later, in May 1945. Japan surrendered in August. Bob Hoover transitioned from combat pilot to test pilot, then to one of aviation's most celebrated demonstration pilots. He flew at air shows around the world for nearly 50 years. His aerobatic routines became legendary in aviation circles. He could fly a twin-engine Aero Commander through a complete aerobatic sequence with both engines shut down, demonstrating energy management and aircraft control at levels few pilots could match. His post-war career revealed how combat experience translated to civilian aviation achievement. Test pilots must push aircraft to their limits while maintaining enough margin for survival when systems fail. This requires precisely calibrated risk assessment, the same skill that allowed Hoover to escape in a stolen aircraft. Airshow demonstration flying demands absolute precision while maintaining safety margins for audience protection. Again, the core skill is risk management, deciding which maneuvers are acceptably dangerous and which are suicidal. He flew chase plane for Chuck Yeager's Bell X-1 supersonic flight in 1947, documenting one of aviation's most significant achievements. He tested numerous aircraft for North American aviation during the Korean War, providing critical feedback on fighter performance. He trained pilots and demonstrated aircraft capabilities to military units throughout the 1950s. His influence on American aviation extended across decades, but the escape remained the defining story of his combat service. It represented something more than technical skill or luck. It represented the kind of improvisation and determination that characterized Allied airmen throughout the war. These were men trained to operate at the edge of technological capability, who understood machines intimately enough to adapt them to circumstances their designers never imagined. The broader implications extended beyond individual achievement. Hoover's escape demonstrated how technical education creates adaptive capacity. He succeeded not because he knew the FW-190 specifically, but because he understood aircraft generally. This distinction is fundamental. Specific knowledge becomes obsolete as technology evolves. Fundamental understanding remains applicable across technological generations. Modern military training increasingly emphasizes this adaptability. Pilots learn not just how to fly specific aircraft, but how aircraft systems function fundamentally. Mechanics learn not just repair procedures, but engineering principles. This educational philosophy emerged partly from lessons learned during World War II, when personnel frequently encountered unfamiliar equipment and had to adapt rapidly. Hoover's escape also revealed the psychological dimension of technical expertise. Flying the FW-190 required not just understanding its systems, but managing fear, maintaining focus under extreme stress, making rapid decisions with incomplete information. These psychological capabilities matter as much as technical knowledge. The most skilled technician who panics under pressure cannot function effectively. Conversely, someone with moderate technical skill but exceptional psychological resilience can achieve extraordinary outcomes. The FW-190 that Hoover flew to freedom represented German engineering at its finest. Kurt Tank, the aircraft's designer, had created a fighter that balanced performance, reliability, and ease of production. The BMW 801 engine provided power without the cooling complexity of inline designs. The wide landing gear made it forgiving during takeoff and landing. The control harmony gave pilots confidence in demanding maneuvers. Even in 1945, with Germany's aviation industry collapsing, the FW-190 remained a formidable aircraft. That Hoover could master it in minutes testified to both the aircraft's design and his own skill. Good aircraft are intuitive. Their controls respond predictably. Their systems operate logically. The FW-190, despite being labelled in German and configured differently from Allied fighters, was fundamentally a well-designed machine. Hoover recognized this and exploited it. This interaction between excellent design and skilled operation produces outcomes neither could achieve independently. When Bob Hoover died in 2016, the aviation community mourned not just a skilled pilot, but a connection to aviation's formative era. Hoover had flown with the pioneers, tested the prototypes, demonstrated the possibilities. He represented a generation that had transformed aviation from dangerous adventure into routine transportation, from military specialty into global industry. The escape from Stalag Luft I was part of that larger story, a dramatic moment that revealed capabilities developed over decades of dedication to flight. The windmills he saw from the cockpit of the stolen FW-190 marked more than geographical transition from enemy to friendly territory. They marked the boundary between captivity and freedom, between desperate improvisation and achieved safety, between war and whatever came after. That he recognized them through exhaustion and stress, that he successfully landed despite unfamiliarity with the aircraft, that he survived to tell the story. These outcomes seem almost inevitable in retrospect, but were anything but certain in the moment. The story endures because it crystallizes essential truths about human capability under extreme pressure. When familiar tools become unavailable, skilled practitioners adapt to unfamiliar ones. When circumstances become desperate, people discover resources they did not know they possessed. When systems collapse, individuals improvise solutions. These capacities exist in all humans, activated by necessity, refined by training, demonstrated by those like Bob Hoover who found themselves in situations demanding everything they could give.